They found the first hand at dawn. The fog had rolled in heavy that morning, crawling low through the hollows like a beast reluctant to leave. Fields sat quiet and breathless under the gray hush, as though nature itself had drawn a curtain over something it did not wish to see. On the edge of Sand Creek, near a bend where the birch trees grew thin and mournful, 2 farm hands from the McRae estate were fixing a fence when one of them spotted it, jutting from the damp, freshly turned soil like the broken limb of a marionette. It was a hand, unmistakably human. The fingers curled in death's grasp, skin darkened by exposure and the cold. A wedding band still clung to the third finger, its gold dulled by filth and time. By noon, Sheriff Reuben Foley had cordoned off the area and ordered silence. No official statement. No visitors. No preachers or reporters. Just a quiet burial, under watch, in an unmarked plot outside town. But Kabul was not a town that stayed silent for long. Whispers threaded through the streets like smoke, low talk in taverns, confessions behind altar rails, and children repeating what they should not have heard. What disturbed folks most wasn't just the grave, nor the ring, nor even the second, third, and fourth burial sites uncovered in the following days. It was who hadn't been seen in town since the thaw. Surveyors. Traders. Travelers from the east. Those who'd stayed at the Harper Lodge. The Harper brothers had come to Kabul like the black rain, sudden, silent, and bearing a chill that settled deep. John and Silas Harper. Tall, angular men in black wool coats too fine for this county, their accents too polished, their eyes too still. They had arrived the previous spring, buying up an old hunting lodge out past Dogwood Ridge, converting it into what they called a guest house for discerning travelers. But none could recall ever being invited. They were seen often, but always separately. One would appear at the general store to buy candles and lie, while the other collected mail at the depot. The two were never seen in the same place at the same time. People joked about it at first. Then they stopped joking. Old women began locking their doors before the lamps were lit. Children were warned not to go near the tree line. And when the Harper's black wagon rolled into town, its iron wheels creaking against the cobblestone, men would tip their hats, avert their eyes, and mutter prayers under their breath. For there were rumors of the cellar beneath that lodge. Cold stone walls, damp with something more than time. And sounds, muffled, rhythmic sounds, heard late at night when the fog rolled in, and the forest seemed to lean closer. They said the Harper Lodge was a place where men went missing. Where names were erased. Where something ancient stirred beneath the floorboards. And they were right. The train rolled into Kabul behind schedule, its iron belly exhaling steam like a wounded beast. The platform was empty, save for a boy kicking stones and a hound asleep in the dust. No brass band, no welcoming committee. Just the wind scraping dry leaves across the boards and a faint sour smell wafting from the freight car. Marshal Andrew Clark stepped off with a long coat stiff from travel and a satchel slung over his shoulder. 43 years old, 6 feet tall, gray at the temples with a limp from Shiloh. His eyes scanned the town as if cataloging sin. He wasn't here for ceremony. He was here for the missing. Daniel Morris, a government surveyor out of St. Louis, had vanished 4 weeks earlier. His last telegram came from Kabul. Storm coming. Delay likely. Will lodge near Sand Creek. Will right after. No letter followed. The U.S. Marshal Service dispatched Clark, quietly. No press. No fanfare. He arrived under the name Mr. Kane, a land investor. Kabul didn't like strangers. Faces turned away. Doors half-closed behind him. He found lodging at the Bender boarding house, modest, clean, no questions. Mrs. Bender, a stout widow with watery eyes, warned him not to walk past Dogwood Ridge after sundown. Coyotes, she said, but her hands trembled when she lit his lamp. Clark began with the obvious, the Harpers. In the town ledger, he found a record of Daniel Morris purchasing supplies at Prescott's general store, salt pork, lamp oil, a map, and a bottle of rye. A clerk named Ruthie remembered him as polite. Asked about the Harper Lodge, she said. Said he heard it had the best bed in the county. She didn't know if he made it there. No one did. Clark rode out the next morning. The Harper Lodge stood 2 miles beyond the edge of map trails. Built of old timber, its shutters painted black, the roof steep like a church's. Ivy choked the north side, and the windows looked out like empty sockets. The air there was colder, he felt it in his bones, though the sun shone strong that day. John Harper greeted him on the porch. Slim, impeccably dressed, eyes like wet coal. He smiled without warmth. "A traveler?" John asked. "You're a rare sight." Clark introduced himself as Kane, seeking land near the river. John nodded, said rooms were available, but advised staying only one night. "The forest carries sickness this time of year," he explained. "Mist rot the lungs." Inside, the lodge was silent. Dustless. Overclean. The walls bore paintings of ancient cities, Babylon, Petra, Persepolis, half-lit by oil lamps that flickered though there was no draft. Clark was shown to a room on the second floor. "Breakfast at dawn," John said. "Dinner at dusk. No calls after dark. My brother sleeps slightly." That evening, Clark sat at a long oak table set for one. Silas Harper arrived at dusk, wordless, eyes identical to John's, though he bore a stitched scar along his jaw. The brothers never spoke in each other's presence. When one entered, the other vanished. It was like watching a man split across 2 bodies. Clark asked about Daniel Morris. John blinked slowly. "Many pass through," he said. "We keep no register. Just meals and rest." "No one by that name?" "None I recall." Clark noted the lie. He had already found Morris's name etched faintly into the guestbook beneath the bar, lightly scrawled, half erased, but there. Dated August 26th. That night sleep evaded him. From somewhere below came muffled noises, metal striking stone. Rhythmic. Measured. Then a low, drawn-out sound. Not animal. Not human. Something between. He dressed silently and stepped into the hallway. Floorboards whispered beneath his boots. A dim light flickered under the cellar door. He moved closer. There were voices. 2, maybe 3, speaking in something guttural, not English, not German. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Then a loud scraping, and the light vanished. He retreated just as the lock clicked. The next day, Clark examined the surrounding woods. Behind the lodge he found a patch of disturbed earth, large, flat, no grass. Something had been buried, then unearthed. He knelt, brushed away loose soil, and found shattered glass, bottlenecks, medical vials, and beneath that, something slick. Flesh, or what remained of it. That night, he returned to Kabul and wrote to his superior. "This is not a case of a single disappearance. I believe there is a systematic pattern here. I suspect the Harpers are involved in a series of crimes extending beyond local jurisdiction. Will remain under cover." In the following days, Clark questioned townsfolk under pretense of land deals. Patterns emerged. Travelers who stayed at the lodge were rarely seen again. A peddler, 2 German miners, a pair of sisters en route to Kansas. All logged at the depot. None logged departing. One man, Jasper Tully, vanished in July. His horse was later found grazing near the lodge. The sheriff dismissed it as a robbery gone wrong. Odd purchases came up in ledgers, surgical instruments, sea salt, preserving chemicals. Silas Harper once bought 10 glass jars in one day. The grocer thought little of it. Said he was pickling. He'd shrugged. "Didn't strike me as the type." Clark tracked each item. The sum painted a picture. These were not mere innkeepers. This was preparation. Locals began to avoid him. Children stared but did not speak. The pastor at St. Luke's offered an unsolicited warning. "Some men wear the shape of men but are hollow underneath. Don't follow them into the trees." That night, the lodge windows remained dark. No lamps. No voices. Clark walked the perimeter with a revolver tucked beneath his coat. The cellar door had a new padlock. He did not sleep. She came to him in the rain. A lean drizzle had hung over the town since morning, slicking the roads and dimming the air to a kind of permanent twilight. Marshal Clark was finishing a plain supper at the boarding house when the knock came. Mrs. Bender opened the door to find a woman soaked to the bone, her bonnet limp with water, her shawl torn and clinging to her frame like a second skin. She said her name was Margaret Holloway. Her eyes were blood*T, not from drink, but from exhaustion, the kind earned through months of terror and silence. She would speak only to the man investigating the lodge. When Clark stood from the table, she stared at him for a long time, as if weighing whether he was real or another trick of the forest. "I worked for them," she said at last. "I was their housemaid. I cleaned the cellar." He ushered her upstairs, offered her a dry blanket and a chair near the stove. She accepted them without thanks, hands trembling, eyes never settling. She didn't sit, just stood by the hearth as if too tired to rest. "I only meant to stay a week," she began. "Back in June. I'd answered an ad. They paid in coin, good coin. Said the work would be easy, the rooms few, the guests respectable. They said I wouldn't be troubled." She paused to stare at the fire, as if the memory clawed at her. "At first it was true. The house was always clean. Too clean. There was never dust. Never insects. Not even spiders in the corners. I started to think it wasn't natural. The cellar, that's where it started." Clark didn't interrupt. He waited. "They told me never to go down unless I was called. But I did. On the third night. I smelled something." She wrapped the blanket tighter. "It was sharp. Not rot. More like burnt oil and blood. And salt. I thought maybe rats had gotten into the meat storage. So I went down. The cellar steps were stone," she said, worn smooth in the center as if from decades of passing feet. The deeper she went, the colder the air grew, not with autumn chill, but a dead, dry cold like the inside of a crypt. "There was a second door," she whispered. "Metal. Locked from the inside. Behind it I heard sounds. Not voices. Not words. Something like—" She shook her head, unable or unwilling to describe it. "What kind of sounds?" Clark asked softly. "Dragging. Chains. Sometimes moaning. But long and slow, like someone not quite human." She turned to him. "I heard someone down there, Marshal. Alive. I know it." From that day forward, Margaret said, she was watched. Subtly, but always. When she entered the kitchen, she'd find tools rearranged. At night, doors she knew she'd locked were ajar. The Harpers never confronted her. They smiled, always, and asked if she needed anything. "But I wasn't alone," she added. "There was a young man, Ben Lacey. A stable hand. He'd worked for them longer. He warned me once, told me not to ask questions. He said he was planning to leave." "What happened to him?" Her lip trembled. "He disappeared. They told me he'd run off to Arkansas. But his things were still in the loft. His boots. His coat. His Bible. He wouldn't have left those." Then she told Clark something that turned his stomach. "There were stains on the dining room floor," she said. "Under the rug. I tried scrubbing them. They wouldn't come out. Not grease. Not wine. Something else. The rug was stitched to the floor to keep it hidden." Clark nodded grimly. "It fit. But it was the crates," she said finally, voice barely audible. "That made me leave." In late September, 2 days before she fled, Margaret had helped Silas unload a delivery. The wagon arrived late, almost midnight. No driver, just the Harpers. She was told to fetch towels and fresh linens. But she saw the contents. Crates, 5 of them. Heavy. Unmarked. They smelled wrong. The kind of smell that clings to skin even after washing. One broke open on the step. Inside was straw burlap, and a hand. Small. Pale. Twisted in death. Margaret ran. That night barefoot, through the trees, taking only her shoes and a rosary. "I walked to Kabul. Slept in the hay behind the chapel. I didn't know who to tell. They said the sheriff was theirs. But then I heard about you. The stranger asking questions. She met his gaze. I know they'll come looking for me. Clark's jaw tightened. They won't find you, he said. He arranged for Margaret to stay at Reverend Combs' rectory under protection. The pastor, a thin man with shaking hands and a locked study full of obscure theology, agreed with no hesitation. I've heard things too, he murmured to Clark. In confession. Things I've prayed to forget. That night, Clark sat alone in his room, lamp low, revolver on the table. He opened his notebook and wrote. Confirmed. Witnesses establish a pattern of concealment and violence at Harper Lodge. There is a second chamber. Possibly for confinement. Evidence of missing persons, including staff. Crates possibly used for transport of bodies. All indications point to premeditated, repeated murder. He closed the book and stared at the ceiling. The wind howled beyond the shuttered glass. Somewhere, far off in the woods, came the faintest echo of metal on stone. And Clark knew, the Harpers weren't finished. Not yet. October 6 to 11, 1877, Kabul, Missouri. Marshal Clark worked like a man trying to beat the grave. By dawn each day, he rode out to the edge of Dogwood Ridge and circled the Harper Lodge at a distance. He noted every delivery wagon, every shift of lantern light, every movement at the windows. At night, he cross-referenced names from the guest book he'd copied by lamplight, matching handwriting, entry dates, and regional reports of disappearances. The pattern was not only real, it was methodical. The guest register itself was a relic. Bound in black leather, no dates after October 1st were listed. The names were neatly inscribed, all in the same hand. Not one bore the unevenness of a rushed traveler. Clark compared several of the names: Henry Talbot of Memphis, Lillian Graves of Atchison, Jonas Reeve of Springfield, against census rolls and missing persons ledgers. Not a single one had left Missouri. Not a single one had ever been reported arriving at their next destination. In many cases, Clark found open-ended correspondences, letters from families still waiting for a word, a telegram, some proof of life. Some had even written back to the lodge, begging for news. Those letters had never been answered. Clark mapped it out on the back of a tavern invoice: one disappearance every 3 to 5 weeks since April. 2 in July. All guests at the Harper Lodge. Always adults. Never children. Never locals. Behind the house, he found a grove of trees with no birds. The soil was loamy, disturbed. 6 distinct depressions, uniform in size. No headstones. No markings. Just earth turned over and packed down. In one, a splinter of cloth poked through, weather-worn, red, lace-edged. He dug with his knife until he reached wood. It was not a coffin. It was a crate. Like freight. That night, he bribed the telegraph operator in Houston with $2 and a bottle of rye. 3 messages went out: to St. Louis, to Little Rock, to a former Union captain who now worked for the Pinkertons in Kansas City. His request was simple: search your records. Find the names. Look for a pattern. But even as he worked, Kabul tightened its jaws around him. At the saloon, conversations died when he entered. Farmers looked away. The sheriff, Reuben Foley, stopped acknowledging him altogether. Clark saw him twice, once leaving the barber, once slipping behind the church with a bottle tucked under his coat. Both times, he avoided Clark's eye. Only the Reverend remained helpful. Combs met him late on October 7th in the vestry, pale and shivering, and laid a sheaf of notes on the table. "Confessions I've kept private," he said. "But I believe the Lord Himself would forgive this breach." The notes were fragmentary. Transcribed mutterings from townsfolk too frightened to say the words aloud. Clark read them in silence. Screams in the woods? Always after midnight. Buried something big. Bigger than a man. The older Harper was seen carrying a sack leaking blood. A girl vanished after cleaning their rooms. No one looked. Clark folded the notes and pocketed them. Then came the ledgers. Prescott's store, the only general mercantile for 20 miles, kept records back to 1870. With Ruthie's help, Clark reviewed each entry tied to the Harper account. Between April and September, the Harpers had purchased 8 jars of ether, 20 pounds of sea salt, 6 sets of surgical clamps, a case of formalin, multiple lengths of chain, lengths varying from 4 to 9 feet, 3 dozen glass jars, half-pint, with wire seals, books. Always books. On anatomy, Mesopotamian ritual, alchemy, and esoteric sciences. What do 2 innkeepers want with surgical clamps and sea salt? Clark asked aloud, and Ruthie paled. She told him something else then. Something she hadn't shared before. I saw Silas with one of the jars, she whispered. He came to collect it when the shipment arrived. But before he could take it, it fell. Cracked open. Smelled like pickled meat and death. Inside was something. A thing like a liver, but too long. And it had teeth. She wept, quietly ashamed. I didn't say anything. I didn't want trouble. Clark understood. Fear here had grown roots. Not just terror, but complicity. The town knew. At least parts of it. Maybe not the full horror, but enough. Enough to stay quiet. The next day, he returned to the lodge. He posed again as Cain, interested in land near the Gasconade River. John Harper received him in the parlor. There was tea, clove-scented, too warm for the season. Silas did not appear. I must apologize for my brother's absence, John said. He's unwell. He rarely sleeps these days. The air disagrees with him. Clark made note. Silas had not been seen in public for 3 days. He feigned interest in the room again. Perhaps I'll stay another night, he said. John's smile tightened. I wouldn't advise it. This house was built with thin walls. One hears too much. That night, Clark did not sleep. He moved through the house barefoot, revolver in hand, tracing the outline of the floor. He found the locked door in the cellar again. But this time, he saw something he hadn't before, 3 chalk symbols drawn around the frame. Circular, overlapping, with an hourglass motif repeated. Wards. Protective or binding. He scratched one off. The sound from within came instantly, a gasp, wet and low, followed by scratching. He ran. He returned to Kabul by dawn. His coat was damp with dew. His knuckles white. He knew then what the lodge was. Not just a house. A vault. A laboratory. A prison. Perhaps all 3. And what the Harpers were doing, what they had done, was no accident. It was a study. A practice. An experiment. The forest changed after the 10th. Clark could feel it in the ground beneath his boots, how the soil gave too easily, how the wind didn't pass through the trees so much as swirl among them, as if trapped. The mist began to linger longer than before, and birds, once loud with autumn chatter, had vanished. Even the hounds stopped barking. The silence that settled over Dogwood Ridge was not the hush of peace, but the silence of a held breath. The Harpers had stopped receiving guests. Clark confirmed it with Ruthie at the general store and with Thomas Coyle at the livery. No new travelers, no wagons, no movement. The lodge sat still. Closed shutters. No chimney smoke. But at night, the black wagon still rolled. It passed through town without stopping, wheels groaning against the earth. No driver could be seen. Just the shape of a man in the back, sometimes 2. On the morning of October 12th, Clark returned to the cemetery behind St. Luke's with Reverend Combs. Together they unearthed one of the shallow graves Clark had discovered weeks earlier. Beneath the clay, they found what they feared. The body of a man in his 30s. Arms bound behind his back. Chest cavity opened with surgical precision. Heart and lungs absent. Combs crossed himself 3 times. This was not robbery. Nor war. This is something ancient. Something older than law. Clark didn't reply. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating timelines, resources, escape routes. He'd seen this before. Not this exact horror, but the rhythm of it, how monsters grew bold when they felt the noose tighten. The Harpers were preparing to vanish. That afternoon, he assembled a posse. He chose carefully men who had no debts to the sheriff, no kin near the Harpers, and no interest in turning back. 4 of them agreed: Ed Ransom, a trapper and rifleman; Lewis Crane, a former Pinkerton dismissed for excessive zeal; Luther Cobb, a half-Mandan scout who had tracked raiders through the Black Hills; and Father Combs, whose faith had turned grim and flint-hard since uncovering the grave. They rode out at dusk, avoiding the main road. The forest swallowed them. Even the animals seemed to withdraw at their passing. The plan was simple: surround the lodge by nightfall, breach it from 3 sides, and seize any living person inside. If necessary, they would burn it to the ground. But the lodge was not empty. Its windows glowed faintly behind heavy curtains. A sickly yellow light, like lanterns burning whale oil. Clark crouched by the tree line, watching. A wagon stood behind the barn, unhitched, empty, but its boards still wet from use. They crept forward, muskets and pistols drawn. Clark kicked in the back door. What they found inside was not chaos, but order. Immaculate, quiet, and set like a stage. The dining table had been laid with silverware and cut crystal, as though awaiting guests. Candles burned down to nubs, dripping wax into cold plates. A roast sat untouched at the center, still warm, though no fire had been lit for hours. The kitchen smelled faintly of antiseptic. Not lye. Ether. They moved room to room. No resistance. No people. Until they reached the cellar. There, they found the second door open. Behind it, a spiral staircase led down, far deeper than the foundation of any hunting lodge should have gone. The air changed as they descended. It grew denser, heavier, metallic. The light dimmed, and the walls turned from brick to stone. At the bottom was a chamber. The room was circular, about 20 feet wide, with high walls etched in faded symbols. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars, each holding parts of men. Eyes. Livers. Fingers. A heart floating in green fluid, still twitching. At the center stood a great oak table, blackened with old blood. Shackles had been fitted to its edges. Beneath it, a drain. There were no bodies. Just journals. Dozens of them, stacked neatly. Clark flipped through the topmost volume. Diagrams of brain tissue. Notes in elegant script detailing attempts at transfer of essence. Accounts of failed hosts, of compatibility, of chemical thresholds. Experiments. Each victim a trial. Ransom retched in the corner. Cobb stood stone still, reading the symbols on the walls. And then came the sound. Above them, from the trees beyond the lodge, voices. 2 men, speaking in unison. Not echoing. Matching. The exact same tone, rhythm, words. They were outside. Clark and his men gave chase. Out through the broken back door, into the trees they ran. The fog had returned, thick and wet, glowing faintly as if lit from within. Footsteps crackled ahead, light, swift. Clark caught a glimpse through the trees, 2 figures, black coats billowing, moving in perfect synchrony. Not running. Gliding. Ransom raised his rifle, but Clark grabbed his arm. No sound. They moved faster, deeper, branches clawing their faces, mud *king at their boots. Then the forest shifted. The trees grew closer. The path vanished. The light dimmed to a bruise-colored haze. And the voices returned, now all around them. Whispering. 2. 4. 6. Clark turned. Cobb was gone. Cobb! He shouted. No answer. They ran forward, but the Harpers had vanished. In their place, only fog. They returned to the lodge an hour later. Ransom shaking. Combs whispering prayers. Clark didn't speak. He stared at the journals clutched in his hands. They were not chasing men. They were chasing a process. They returned at dawn. Clark hadn't slept in 2 nights. Neither had Ransom. Combs had taken ill, shivering in the church crypt, muttering scripture that frayed at the edges of meaning. Cobb remained missing. The only trace of him had been found 3 days earlier, a strip of leather from his boot, nailed to a tree beside a symbol etched deep into the bark, one of the same symbols from the cellar wall. The journals had been sent north, hidden in the cargo of a passing supply train under the name of Private Estate Archives. Clark kept only one, the last volume, always at his side. It was half-filled. The entries grew erratic, fevered. Phase transition unstable. Subject number 27 rejected the integration. We must attempt synchronization in a controlled host, not externally. Simultaneity is essential. The flesh is too weak. We must converge through mind, not matter. And at the very end, final experiment begins November 14th. Full convergence attempted. If successful, there will be no return. Clark read the date again. It was today. They saddled their horses before dawn, 3 men silent in the frost. The sky was a copper bruise, stars fading in the east. They brought rifles, ropes, oil flasks, and one thing more, a small iron crucifix Margaret Holloway had hidden in her apron the day she fled. She pressed it into Clark's palm as he left. "Don't speak their names," she whispered. "Names bind." They rode hard into the trees. The mist did not part for them. It accepted them, welcomed them. The lodge waited. It stood unchanged. Windows shut. Doors closed. But from the chimney rose a slow, thick plume of smoke, scented not with wood, but resin. Burning herbs. Alchemical fumes. Clark and Ransom circled from opposite ends. Combs waited at the rear, tasked with sealing the escape route. At Clark's signal, they breached the front. The door gave easily. Inside, the air pulsed with warmth and rot. Candles lined every wall, hundreds, each black, each burning low, smoke curling upward like tendrils. The dining room was gone. In its place stood an open floor, a chalk circle 7 feet wide drawn on the floorboards, the boards themselves darkened with ancient symbols. 2 chairs sat across from each other, facing inward, each occupied. John and Silas Harper. Naked to the waist, foreheads marked in ash, their hands outstretched to each other but not touching. Their eyes were closed. Lips moving. Whispering in unison. The words had no root in English. They were old. Older than tongues. Ransom raised his rifle. "Don't shoot," Clark hissed. "We need them alive." But it was too late. One Harper opened his eyes. And smiled. The smile spread slowly, too slowly. Not like a twitch of muscle, but like a mask being stretched across bone. The second Harper opened his eyes, and they were the same. Not similar. Identical. One mind. 2 bodies. The room groaned. The symbols on the floor lit from within, red and wet, as if bleeding upward through the wood. The brothers rose in perfect synchrony, not looking at each other, not even seeming to breathe. Clark fired. The bullet struck Silas in the shoulder. He staggered, but John bled. They cried out in one voice, high, unearthly. Not pain. Protest. The air changed. A wind blew from beneath the floor, hot and fetid, like breath exhaled from a tomb. The candles went out all at once. Darkness. Then came the screams. Not from the Harpers. From outside. Combs. Clark rushed to the back door, stumbling over his own feet. He threw it open and froze. The woods were full of light. Not daylight. Not fire. But something phosphorescent. Shapes moved within it, figures, silhouettes thin and tall. Some were doubled, walking in perfect tandem. Others moved backward. Some crawled. Clark raised his lantern and caught a glimpse of Combs, his head tilted back, mouth agape in silent terror, eyes rolled white. He stood stiff as a corpse, one hand gripping the iron crucifix as if it had burned itself into his skin. Then he fell. Ransom shouted from inside. "They're going upstairs." Clark turned. The Harpers were no longer in the ritual room. But the blood remained, still fresh, still glistening. He followed the footprints, bare and precise, leading to the second floor. Up the stairs. Past locked doors. To the attic. He kicked the door. The room was circular, windowless. A copper basin stood at the center, filled with black liquid. Above it, a strange mechanism of glass and brass spun slowly, fueled by no visible source. The Harpers stood across from each other, hands now joined, chanting faster. The walls trembled. Clark saw their flesh ripple, as though struggling to remain defined. One had lost his outline, his shoulder was melting into the other. "Stop!" Clark yelled. They didn't. He raised the crucifix and stepped inside the circle. The reaction was immediate. The mechanism shattered. The basin exploded in a flash of steam. The Harpers screamed, not as men, but as something far older. Their joined hands smoked, blistered, and then separated. The room collapsed in on itself, walls folding, shadows bending. Clark leapt. He landed hard on the staircase as the attic above imploded with a sound like stone grinding teeth. Silence. He rose slowly, head bleeding, coat scorched. The second floor was gone. The Harpers were gone. Not dead, gone. No bodies. No bones. No blood. Just ash. And the smell of burnt paper. Ransom found him moments later. Together they fled the house, dragging the dazed Combs behind them. The lodge stood for one more hour. Then, without fire, without force, it sank. The earth opened like a mouth and swallowed it whole. No collapse. No thunder. Just stillness. By noon, nothing remained. Only the dirt. And the circle scorched into it, still warm. Kabul, Missouri, winter, 1877 to 1878. Snow fell early that year, blanketing the hills in white long before the harvest could finish. The ground hardened like bone. Whatever secrets the forest had kept, it now buried deep beneath a sheath of silence. The Harper Lodge was gone. In its place, a crater of scorched soil and shattered stone, as though something had clawed its way from beneath rather than collapsed from above. Sheriff Foley never filed a report. He left town 3 days later, destination unknown, and was never seen again. But Clark remained. For 6 more weeks, he oversaw the excavation. It began with a team of 5, then 3, then none. Men refused to dig after what they uncovered. Even hardened gravediggers fled the site, muttering of unnatural things in the clay, and bones that whispered. In total, they found 7 bodies. 6 adults. 1 child. Each buried shallow, chest down, backs flayed open as if something had been removed through the spine. Organs missing. Joints dislocated. Teeth pulled. But not haphazardly, surgically. Precisely. Daniel Morris was among them. Clark recognized the compass still clipped to his belt. The others could not be named. Only one body bore identifying items, a woman's locket containing a tiny daguerreotype of a child. On the back was etched, L. Graves, Atchison, 1875. The same name Clark had found in the erased ledger. Each victim's remains were wrapped and interred in Kabul's Potter's Field. Reverend Combs led the service. His voice cracked often. Some said it was the cold. Others knew better. No townsfolk attended. The journals Clark had rescued were studied quietly in St. Louis, under the auspices of a university professor named Dr. Albert Roche, who had once published on comparative mythology before retreating into obscurity. His correspondence to Clark was terse. The language resembles Akkadian mixed with pre-Indo-European glyphs. Some references appear in Near Eastern cultic fragments, but are garbled. The theory of dual convergence is alchemical, mind divided, rejoined through ritual and blood. A belief in shared consciousness, not metaphorical but literal. Highly dangerous. If they succeeded, they did not leave as men. Clark filed his report with the Federal Marshal's Office. It was classified under unsolved disappearances. No arrests. No warrants. No official record of the lodge, or of the Harpers, was maintained beyond that. But rumors spread. Within months, a shopkeeper in Memphis claimed 2 well-dressed men had visited, asking for rare herbs and glass phials. He described them as twins, identical down to the freckle. In New Orleans, a boarding house owner reported two brothers staying a single night, paying in old silver coins and burning incense that made the dogs whine. In Havana, a physician wrote of a lecture attended by a singular man with two shadows, who vanished before the audience could ask questions. None of these accounts were confirmed. But they arrived too frequently, and too precisely, to dismiss. Clark left Missouri in early 1878. He traveled west, changed his name, and bought a small ranch outside Fort Laramie. Neighbors knew him as quiet, private, always watching the horizon. He died in 1894, leaving behind no family, only a journal, sealed in oilskin and hidden beneath the floorboards. The final entry read, "I do not believe they died. I believe they merged. A single mind housed in two vessels, flickering between them. They were trying to become more than men. They may have succeeded." As for Margaret Holloway, she remained at St. Luke's until her death in 1911. She never again spoke of the Harpers. But every autumn, she would walk alone to the edge of Sand Creek and scatter salt in a perfect circle. She claimed it was for the dead. The Harpers' journals, sealed by the university, were later lost in a fire during the 1904 World's Fair. Only Dr. Roche's private notes remain, scattered, fragmented, passed among occult historians like forbidden scripture. One excerpt reads, "The transfer was incomplete. They require symmetry. Hosts must mirror. If they return, they will seek likeness. The land where the lodge once stood lies overgrown now. Trees have reclaimed the clearing. No foundation remains. Hunters avoid the area. They say compasses fail near the old site. That animals refuse to cross it. That sometimes, only in late autumn, you can hear footsteps pacing in tandem through the underbrush, though no one is there. Locals call it the Hollowwood. Children are told never to play there. Dogs will not follow." And once, in 1932, a surveyor mapping old land boundaries vanished near the ridge. His assistant said he'd gone to get a better view, and simply never returned. Only his boots were found, placed side by side beside a fresh circle of scorched leaves. Some say the Harpers still walk there, not as ghosts, but as something else. Something preserved in thought, in hunger, in ritual, waiting for the symmetry to return. So if you ever find yourself in Texas County, Missouri, and the fog rolls in earlier than it should, if you hear twin footsteps behind you where only your own should be, don't turn around. Don't speak their names. And for God's sake, don't follow the light.